late 1967. Somewhere in the A Shau Valley, Vietnam. A 6-man LRRP team from the 1st Cavalry Division has been on the ground for 3 days. They are 22 miles from the nearest friendly position. For 72 hours they have not cooked a meal, because heat from a sternotab rises through jungle canopy and carries scent. And the NVA tracker units operating in this valley are good enough that scent is worth worrying about. The team has been following a supply corridor, logging truck movement, counting soldiers, marking coordinates for artillery. They have moved perhaps 800 meters in 3 days. They have not spoken above a whisper since they stepped off the helicopter, and the rotor noise faded into the canopy above them. Then the situation changes. The way situations change in this war, with almost no warning. A point element from an NVA company cuts across the team's intended extraction route. Not the main force. A point element, meaning the main force is behind it. The team leader, a staff sergeant who has been running long-range missions in this country since 1965, and has survived this kind of convergence before, transmits on the emergency frequency. What he transmits is not a grid coordinate or a status report. It is 2 words that every helicopter unit in the theater has been briefed to treat as a drop-everything call. Prairie Fire. In the next 40 minutes, everything that will happen to these 6 men depends on a piece of equipment that is not in the Army supply catalog, cannot be requisitioned through standard channels, and that some of the men on this team paid for out of their own pockets. It is not a weapon. It is not a radio. It weighs less than 2 pounds. It is a system of sewn nylon webbing with D-rings at the chest, worn against the body since the moment they stepped off the insertion helicopter 3 days ago. And it is the only reason any of them will see the inside of a fire support base again. Before we go on, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far this story travels. And if you're loving it so far, join the family by hitting subscribe, because tomorrow we've got something special lined up just for you. Begin with the name, because the name shapes everything else about the story. LRRP, Long Range Reconnaissance Patrol, pronounced LRRP, universally, in the field, because abbreviations that require spelling out belong to the officers writing the orders, and not to the men executing them. The concept was not invented in Vietnam but found its definitive operational form there. And the form it took was this: a small team, 4 to 6 soldiers, inserted by helicopter into enemy-controlled territory, ordered above all else to observe and report and avoid contact, and extracted when the mission concluded, or when the situation made staying impossible. The tactical logic of the LRRP was smallness. A 6-man team moving carefully through triple-canopy jungle had a realistic chance of remaining invisible for days. A platoon of 30 made noise at a level skilled trackers could detect and left sign that even mediocre trackers could follow. The team's protection was identical to what made it useful. It was small enough to be a ghost. Movement discipline was, by any ordinary military standard, extreme. Teams sometimes covered less than 300 meters in a full operational day, not because the terrain was impassable, but because speed generates noise, noise generates detection, and detection in this environment was lethal. Hand signals replaced spoken communication. Meals were eaten cold. Teams changed their planned routes constantly, never assuming the path selected the previous night was still the safe one. The Army began formalizing LRRP units in 1966, drawing on Special Forces experience and lessons from earlier advisory operations. MACV-SOG, the classified command running cross-border reconnaissance into Laos and Cambodia, had its own teams operating on missions that officially did not exist until decades after the fact. The men selected came from infantry, special forces, and ranger-qualified pools, screened for physical fitness and for something harder to evaluate: the capacity to function with sustained precision under psychological pressure that conventional infantry operations rarely produced in the same sustained form. John Plaster, who served with MACV-SOG and later documented the reconnaissance teams in detail, described the selection standard in terms that have nothing to do with physical testing. The question being asked of each candidate was whether he could spend 5 days in a situation where every human instinct was screaming for movement, for noise, for the comfort of other men, at a distance where you could actually hear them, and instead remain still and silent and precise. Most candidates could not. The ones who could became the most valuable intelligence collectors in the theater. A team that completed a 5-day mission in denied territory could identify targets for B-52 arc light strikes. redirect artillery priorities for a full division, or confirm the location of base areas that had not appeared on any map. The intelligence product of a successful LRRP mission was worth considerably more than 6 men and their equipment. The men understood this about themselves. They did not say it out loud. The understanding informed everything about how they approached the problem of getting back out. That problem was the extraction. The insertion and extraction were, consistently, the most dangerous moments of any mission. The team spent the middle days in relative control, moving on their terms, choosing when and where, maintaining the discipline that kept them invisible. The moment a helicopter arrived, all of that ended. The noise announced the team's position to everything within audible range, invisible to unmistakably present in seconds. And in the jungle terrain where most of these operations occurred, the helicopter that came to extract the team often could not land. If your father or your grandfather ran long-range reconnaissance missions in Vietnam, put his unit and his name in the comments. These operations were classified when they ran them, and in many cases stayed partially restricted for decades. The paper record is thin. What survives is mostly what the men chose to tell, and what the men who went out with them chose to write down. To understand what the extraction problem actually looked like in physical terms, stand at the base of a tree in the central highlands of Vietnam. Not in the cleared area near a fire support base. In the forest that the LRRP teams operated in. The real forest, the one the NVA used for the same reason the teams tried to use it. Because it was difficult to see through. Triple-canopy jungle means 3 distinct layers of vegetation above the forest floor. The uppermost canopy ran 60 to 100 feet above ground, sometimes taller. Beneath it, a secondary canopy of smaller trees competing for light. Beneath that, a layer of undergrowth, ferns, vines, and secondary growth that made even foot movement slow. A helicopter, attempting to land in this terrain, had nowhere to put down. A helicopter attempting to hover close enough to the forest floor for men to climb aboard was itself inside the canopy, where rotor wash destroyed visibility, and the rotor blades would contact tree trunks. The standard extraction methods designed for terrain with cleared or semi-cleared landing zones did not transfer. A rope ladder dropped from a hovering helicopter that cannot get below the canopy top reaches the forest floor only if it is long enough to clear 100 feet of trees, and then the men climbing it are in the canopy itself, exposed and slow. The jungle penetrator, a weighted torpedo-shaped device on a cable designed to cut through vegetation and allow men to ride up one at a time, solved the canopy problem, but required the helicopter to hold a stationary hover for the time it took each man to attach and ride the cable up. In a helicopter at low altitude, stationary over enemy-controlled terrain, the time each additional man required to attach and ride up was time measured in ground fire exposure. In the early years of the war, when LRRP and Special Forces teams were already operating in this kind of terrain, and the Army's supply system had provided no specific extraction method for it, the solution came not from an ordnance development program or a requirements document routed through proper channels. It came from a man in the field who looked at the problem and built something. Sergeant Major Charles McGuire served with the 5th Special Forces Group in Vietnam in the mid-1960s. The details of precisely when and where he developed the technique that carries his name are preserved in unit histories and veteran accounts, rather than in the kind of official documentation that would have given the story clean edges, which tells you something about the nature of the problem and the institutional environment in which the solution appeared. The McGuire Rig was, in concept, close to elegant. 3 lengths of rope, approximately 120 feet each, attached to the skids or frame of a UH-1 helicopter. At the bottom of each rope, a loop large enough for a man to sit in, his weight on the loop itself, his hands holding the rope above. The helicopter could carry 2 ropes per skid, accommodating 6 men in a single lift, 3 to each side. The aircraft did not need to land. It did not need to descend below the canopy. It needed to hold a hover at canopy height, lower the ropes through a gap, and wait while 6 men sat in the loops and grabbed on. Then, it flew out of the area at low altitude, 6 men hanging below it, moving through potentially hostile airspace toward friendly territory. The extraction time from the moment the helicopter was overhead to the moment it was out of effective ground fire range was, in favorable conditions, a matter of minutes. Compare that to the time required for a cable extraction lifting 1 man at a time, and the operational advantage is clear. The helicopter was a moving target, rather than a stationary one for most of the extraction. The ground element was below the canopy line only long enough to attach and be lifted. McGuire rigs spread through LRRP and Special Forces units with the velocity that practical solutions always spread through operational communities. By demonstration and word of mouth, without waiting for official authorization. The first rigs were made from climbing rope, from field expedient cord, from whatever 120 feet of nylon could be assembled from in-country. The Army supply system had nothing standardized to offer. Teams made do. This is worth pausing on, because it is not a small thing. A piece of equipment that American soldiers were using to escape from enemy-controlled terrain, in an environment where the failure of that equipment meant death, was being fabricated from improvised materials, because no one in the supply chain had produced a standard version. The men using the McGuire rig understood this. They modified the basic design as best they could, adding padding to the loops, testing rope strengths, refining the attachment methods. They were doing product development in the field, with their lives as the test condition. And the McGuire rig worked. It genuinely worked. Men came back on McGuire rigs, who would not have come back otherwise. The technique was real, and the principle was sound. It also had a flaw. The flaw was not subtle and it was not hidden. Anyone who looked at a man sitting in a rope loop under a helicopter and thought about the things that could go wrong in a combat extraction could identify it without any particular engineering expertise. A man in a McGuire loop uses both hands to hold the rope above the loop. Both hands. For the duration of the attachment process, and for the entire flight out, his hands are on the rope. He cannot use his weapon. He cannot assist a teammate. If the rope rotates, which rope loops suspended from helicopters do, he cannot stop it. And if he loses his grip, because he is wounded badly enough that his hands will not hold, or because he has already lost consciousness before he reached the rope, he falls. The McGuire rig extracted conscious men who were physically capable of holding on. In a combat extraction, conscious and physically capable of holding on was a condition that the extraction was sometimes designed to rescue men from failing to meet. The equipment assumed a level of physical integrity in the man being extracted that the situation generating the extraction sometimes made impossible. Post-war documentation, compiled from after-action reports, medical incident records, and veteran accounts by military historians researching this period, records instances of men lost during McGuire rig extractions not to enemy fire during the extraction itself, but to falls. The wound that a man had been hit with before reaching the rope had done enough damage that grip was impossible. No one could secure him. The loop could not be made to hold an unconscious man who was not actively sitting in it. The Army knew this. Units knew it better. The McGuire rig remained the primary extraction method for non-landing situations for years after the flaw was clearly understood by everyone using it. The supply system had nothing better to offer. So the teams used what they had and accepted the failure mode as the cost of the available solution. That cost was real, and it was paid by specific men in specific places whose names are in records that took decades to become publicly available. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. In 1968, at Special Forces camps in Vietnam, 3 men who had collectively run enough long-range operations to understand the McGuire rig's failure from direct observation built a solution. Their names were Major Robert Stevens, Captain John Knabb, and Sergeant First Class Clifford. The harness they produced bore a name assembled from pieces of theirs. The Stabo harness. To understand what the Stabo solved, you have to understand what the McGuire rig was, and what it was not. The McGuire was a rope loop. A single loop of rope dropped from a hovering helicopter, into which a man inserted himself, and held on while the aircraft climbed away from the extraction point. It was developed in 1965 by Major Charles McGuire, and it was a genuine improvement over the alternative, which in many situations was no extraction capability at all. Deep jungle operations ran into the same problem repeatedly. No landing zones, no clearings, no place for a helicopter to set down and take men aboard. The McGuire rig made vertical extraction possible from terrain that had previously meant that men who could not walk out did not come out. The problem was the grip. In the McGuire system, the man's hands were the connection between himself and the aircraft. He held the rope. If his hands worked and his arms worked, and he retained consciousness, he he was extracted. If any of those conditions failed, the system failed with them. In combat, in the specific violence of an extraction under fire, those conditions failed with a regularity that the men running the missions documented in reports that accumulated in files that the procurement system processed at its own pace. A man hit during the approach to the extraction point might have a functional grip on the rope when the aircraft climbed. He might not have that grip by the time the aircraft cleared the canopy. The McGuire Rig had no answer for the difference between those two moments. The answer was the man, and sometimes the man was no longer in a condition to provide it. Stevens, Nab, and Clifford had seen this. They had seen it or they had heard about it from men who had, and they had arrived at the conclusion that an extraction system, built on the assumption of an intact, conscious, physically functional soldier, was not built for the conditions it was actually being used in. The conditions it was actually being used in included gunshot wounds, shrapnel, blood loss, disorientation, and the specific physical degradation that sets in during multi-day patrols, through jungle terrain, that treats the human body as an obstacle to be worn down. The essential difference between the Stabo and the McGuire Rig was this. The McGuire depended on the man. The Stabo depended on the harness. In the Stabo system, the harness was the connection, and the man wore the harness. It attached to the extraction ropes at 2 D-ring points on the front of the chest. The attachment process took seconds. Once attached, the man was secured regardless of the state of his hands, his arms, or his consciousness. A man unconscious from a gunshot wound could be snapped into a Stabo harness by teammates and extracted. He would arrive at the fire support base alive. With a McGuire loop, he would have been left at the extraction point, because the loop required participation from the person being extracted. That requirement was the flaw, and the flaw was built into the design at the level of the concept, which meant no modification to the rope or the loop could address it. The concept had to change. The Stabo also solved the hands problem in a way that mattered in actual combat. A man snapped in at both D-rings had both hands free for a weapon, free to establish fields of fire during the initial lift, when the team was most exposed and the engagement was most likely to be ongoing. After-action reports from MACV-SOG operations documented team members returning fire during the extraction itself, shooting back through the canopy while the helicopter was still pulling men clear of the trees. The accounts describe men hanging from ropes beneath a climbing aircraft, engaging NVA forces below them, doing the one thing the mission still required of them in those final seconds. A man on a McGuire loop was holding the rope. His weapon was secondary at the moment it needed to be primary. There was one further characteristic that separated the Stabo from everything that had come before it, and this characteristic reflected something about how Stevens, Nab, and Clifford thought about the problem that went beyond the mechanics of the harness itself. It was worn for the entire mission, not donned at the extraction point when the helicopter was inbound and the team was already in contact, and time was the one resource in shortest supply, put on before insertion and removed after extraction. For however many days the patrol ran, through whatever the jungle produced in terms of terrain and weather, and enemy contact, and the accumulated physical cost of operating at that level of sustained stress, the Stabo was on the body. It functioned simultaneously as the primary load-bearing system for ammunition, medical kit, water, and radio accessories. It was not one more item of equipment added to a load that was already at the limit of what men could carry through that terrain for that duration. It was the load-carrying system, designed from the beginning to perform two functions without requiring the soldier to choose between them, or transition from one to the other at the worst possible moment. The men who designed it had been in the field long enough to know that gear requiring a transition from mission configuration to extraction configuration was gear that introduced a failure point precisely when failure was most costly. The transition had to happen under fire, under stress, potentially while men were being hit and teammates were managing casualties, and the helicopter was already taking fire from below. The Stabo removed the transition entirely. The harness was already on. The D-rings were already there. 2 connections, 2 seconds, done. This is the kind of thinking that separates equipment designed by users from equipment designed for users. The Stabo harness was not immediately issued to LRRP units. This will not surprise anyone who has read carefully about American military procurement in Vietnam, or in any other war where the gap between what the supply system provided and what the men using it needed was measured in something more specific than budget cycles and contractor relationships. The STABO was developed in-country by serving officers and an NCO. It did not come from an ordnance contractor working from a requirements document submitted through official channels and reviewed by a committee that had not been on a MACV-SOG patrol and was not scheduled to go on one. It did not have a procurement number. It did not appear in the standard supply tables. It existed as a physical object, worn by the men who built it and by units they briefed personally. Before it existed as anything, the Army supply system had the administrative capacity to process and distribute. The result was familiar. Some units acquired STABO harnesses early, through the informal networks that military organizations develop alongside their official ones. The connections between the right people in the right positions that allow good ideas to move faster than the paperwork. Special Forces units with relationships to the right quartermaster channels sometimes had them before LRRP companies at conventional infantry divisions had heard the name. Improvised versions appeared wherever men understood the principle and could obtain nylon webbing and the hardware required to assemble a functional approximation. The improvised versions were sometimes adequate. They were occasionally dangerous in their own right. The load-bearing calculations of a harness worn under operational conditions in jungle heat and humidity, carrying the weight of a fully equipped soldier through the mechanical stress of a helicopter extraction, require more precision than in-country fabrication with available materials can reliably achieve. A harness attachment point that fails at altitude during extraction is a different problem from a McGuire loop that requires grip, because the man who trusted the harness and found it failing had no fallback position. He had given up the rope for the harness, and the harness had given way. The McGuire loop, for all its failures, at least communicated its limitations through the hands that held it. The Army was issuing a rope loop as its official extraction method, while the men running the missions wore a body harness that addressed the rope loop's documented failures. The time between those two facts was not measured in procurement delays and administrative backlogs. It was measured in the men who went out on McGuire rigs after the STABO existed and did not come back from the extraction phase. Those men are in the after-action reports. Their names are in the casualty records. The harness that might have brought them home was in-country, worn by other men, waiting for a supply system that processed requests on its own schedule, regardless of what the schedule cost. This is not a story about incompetence. The men running the supply system and the men writing procurement requirements were not ignorant of what was happening in the field. Reports moved through channels. After-action accounts described the failure modes. The problem was not that the information did not exist. The problem was that the distance between the information existing and the supply system producing a standard item in sufficient quantity for distribution to all units operating in this role was longer than the operational tempo could accommodate. Teams that understood what they needed and could not get it through channels did what LRRP teams did with every other gear problem they encountered. They solved it themselves. Nylon webbing was available in-country. Hardware could be sourced. Men with sewing experience, or women at local tailor shops near base camps, produced harnesses that met the STABO principle, if not always the precise specifications. The quality varied widely. Some were excellent, some were not. If you have a photograph of your father or your grandfather in Vietnam-era web gear, or if you have a piece of STABO harness, or related extraction equipment in a box from an estate, the 75th Ranger Regiment Association maintains a research archive that has been working for decades to document the equipment and the men who wore it. Unit number and name in the comments. There are people who will recognize it. To understand what the STABO changed in measurable operational terms, work through what a combat extraction from jungle terrain without a landing zone looked like at each stage. The team has been compromised. An NVA unit has made contact, or found sign, or a point element has crossed close enough to the team's position that detection is certain within minutes. The team leader makes the call. He transmits on the emergency frequency, gives the 6-digit grid, and begins moving the team toward the best available extraction point, which is not a clearing, but the largest gap in the canopy within reasonable movement distance. Response time from transmission to first helicopter overhead, documented across multiple unit histories and after-action reports from this period, ran between 12 and 35 minutes depending on aircraft availability, weather conditions, and the distance from the nearest staging base. 12 minutes was fast. 35 minutes was more typical. And in 35 minutes, a follow-up force that had detected the team could close considerable distance. The team was moving during those minutes, moving toward the extraction point, while attempting to maintain the noise discipline that might keep the follow-up force from pinpointing their position exactly. Moving while being pursued, possibly while carrying a wounded team member, possibly while already under fire at distance. The team arrived at the extraction point in whatever condition the preceding 35 minutes had produced. When the helicopter arrived, the crew located the team by radio direction and by signals. A signal mirror, a smoke grenade, the colored air panel that Army doctrine issued, and that any man who had been in country more than a few weeks had learned to use with care, because it was visible to the same people it was meant to signal to. The ropes came down through the canopy. With a McGuire rig, each man found his loop and sat in it, arms wrapped around the rope above. The team leader was typically last into a loop, because he was covering the others while they attached. The moment he dropped into his own loop, no one in the team was able to suppress the tree line. The helicopter lifted. 6 men hung below it, 2 hands per man on the rope, and the follow-up force, if it had reached the extraction zone, was receiving no fire from the team at all. With a stabo harness, a man snapped in with 1 hand. 1 second. 2 seconds. The carabiner went to the D-rings. Done. His weapon stayed up. The team leader could be covering the tree line while snapping his own rings, could be suppressing the follow-up force until the moment the helicopter lifted, could have both hands on a rifle during the entire process except for the 2 seconds of attachment. And when the helicopter climbed and the extraction ropes went taut and the men were lifted from the jungle floor, the hands were still free. Free for the weapons that the situation did not stop requiring the moment the ropes left the ground. Now consider the man who took a round before reaching the extraction point. He is conscious, but his left arm is not functioning. With a McGuire loop, the team can help him into the loop, can try to secure him as best they can, but the loop requires him to hold with something, to maintain upward pressure with at least one functioning arm, to participate actively in not falling. If the wound has done enough damage, that participation is not available. A teammate cannot hold him in a loop from their own position while hanging on their own rope. With a stabo harness, a teammate snaps his D-rings for him. 2 seconds of work by someone else's functioning hands. The wounded man is attached. He does not need to contribute anything to staying on the rope, because the harness holds him regardless. The difference in outcome is not theoretical. It is the difference between a name on the roster of men who made it back and a name in the after-action report under a different category. The helicopter crews who flew these extractions understood this distinction with particular clarity. A UH-1 holding a hover over enemy-controlled terrain at low altitude was accepting ground fire risk for every second it remained in place. The speed with which 6 men could attach and be lifted was not an abstraction to the pilot maintaining that hover. It was the variable that determined how long he was stationary, and stationary at low altitude over enemy terrain was a condition that UH-1 airframes were not designed to sustain indefinitely. The stabo reduced the attachment time, reduced time in the hover, made the extraction faster for the aircraft crew, as much as for the men on the ground. The statistics for LRRP extraction casualty rates across the Vietnam War are not consolidated into a single clean source. The operational records were kept at unit level, classification varied, and the drawdown at the war's end was not kind to paperwork. What exists is fragment unit histories, MACV-SOG operational debriefs that have since been partially declassified, veteran accounts collected by researchers, and the individual service records of men whose outcomes are clear, even when the narrative around them is not. What those fragments show, taken together, is a picture consistent enough to support the argument. In units that adopted the stabo harness and trained specifically on combat extraction procedures, the documented loss rate during the extraction phase of emergency exfiltrations declined relative to the McGuire Rig period. The comparison is imprecise, because unit practices varied, terrain varied, NVA capability in different operational areas varied, and the quality of the improvised early stabo harnesses varied enough that some represented genuine improvement, and some represented a different set of failure modes. But the directional signal in the data is clear, and it points where the engineering argued it would. Specific names from this period are harder to put into a script with full confidence than the historical record on, say, a WWWW tank engagement that was photographed by a Signal Corps cameraman and captured in Army records that have been open for 60 years. The classification history of MACV-SOG operations means that some of the most dramatic documented extraction cases involving the Stabo harness are still being researched, and some details have not been publicly verified to the standard that a documentary history requires. What can be said with confidence is this: men who ran missions with SOG's Command and Control North, Command and Control Central, and Command and Control South, the three regional headquarters that managed cross-border reconnaissance, ran missions in terrain and against opposition that represented the outer limits of what the LRRP concept could survive. The Shining Brass and Prairie Fire operational areas in Laos, the Daniel Boone operations in Cambodia. These were environments where the NVA presence was dense, where anti-aircraft defenses had been developed against years of American air operations, and where a team that called Prairie Fire was doing so in the knowledge that the extraction helicopters would themselves be taking fire from the moment they crossed the border. In that environment, the Stabo harness represented the difference between a team being able to function as a fighting unit during extraction, every man able to use his weapon until the final moment of lift, and a team that went passive the moment they reached the ropes. The operations that required 6 men to suppress active ground contact during the extraction lift phase, which was not an unusual scenario in the SOG operational areas, were precisely the operations for which the McGuire Rig was most inadequate, and the Stabo was most directly suited. The helicopter pilots who flew those extractions, the Air Force Sikorsky H-34 King Bee crews of the Vietnamese Air Force, who flew SOG extractions before American Air Force assets took over more of the mission, and the American pilots who followed them, were operating aircraft under conditions that required specific trust in the ground element's ability to suppress. A helicopter holding a hover for extraction needs the men on the ground to be buying it time. Men buying time with weapons require their hands. The Stabo was also, in this sense, a gift to the aircrew. This is one of the things about equipment in war that rarely appears in the official documentation, but is preserved in the accounts of the men who used it. Gear that helps the infantryman also helps everyone else in the chain, whose job depends on the infantryman being able to do his. The Stabo harness kept the team's weapons active during extraction. That mattered to the men on the ropes. It mattered equally to the men in the aircraft above them. There is a perspective on the Stabo harness and on LRRP extraction methods that rarely appears in the American accounts, because it requires reading the other side's documentation, and because the other side's documentation from this period took decades to become accessible. It is worth the detour, because it illuminates what the extraction equipment actually meant on the ground, rather than in the aircraft. NVA commanders operating in the Central Highlands and along the border corridors in 1967 and 1968 were fully aware that American reconnaissance teams were operating in their rear areas. They could not always detect the teams during the movement phase. That was the point of the movement discipline, but they could track the extractions, and they did. A helicopter performing an extraction in jungle terrain is audible from considerable distance. The approach, the hover, the departure, each phase produces a sound signature that carries through the canopy in ways that ground movement does not. NVA units operating in areas subject to LRP surveillance developed specific response protocols for extraction signatures. Tracker elements were dispatched to the extraction point as quickly as the sound gave them direction. The extraction location was mapped and used to establish patterns of American operational interest. Intelligence about which areas the Americans were watching was itself intelligence, and the extraction was the clearest indicator of where a team had been. This is why the speed of extraction mattered tactically, in a way that went beyond the immediate survival of the 6 men on the ropes. A faster extraction meant less time for a tracker element to consolidate on the extraction zone before the helicopter was gone. It meant less time for anti-aircraft positions to get bearing on the aircraft. It meant fewer seconds in which the follow-up force, moving fast toward the sound, could arrive in time to engage. The teams also sanitized their positions before and during extraction. They policed their brass, left no food waste, removed any sign of occupation that could confirm the team's observations and timings, to a tracker reading the site afterward. The extraction point was the one moment when all of this discipline was interrupted by necessity. 6 men making noise. A helicopter overhead. A smoke grenade deployed for identification. The site was visible in a way the preceding 4 days had not been. Every second saved in the attachment phase was a second of reduced visibility. With McGuire loops, the attachment phase could be slowed by every factor the missions generated. Wounds, darkness, stress, rope rotation, the physical difficulty of sitting in a loop while a follow-up force was in audible range. With snap-in D-ring attachments, the same factors produced much less variability. The attachment was either completed or it was not, and completing it required only 2 seconds of functional movement. The NVA tracker units who arrived at LRP extraction points in this period and found nothing, or found only the depressions in the vegetation where ropes had passed through, were encountering the downstream effect of faster extractions. The team had cleared the zone before the tracker arrived. The equipment had contributed to that margin. In February 1969, the LRRP companies operating with conventional infantry divisions in Vietnam were redesignated as companies of the 75th Infantry, which would become the 75th Ranger Regiment. The transition was a formal recognition of what the long-range reconnaissance mission had become and what kind of unit could execute it. By that point, the accumulated experience of 3+ years of team operations in denied territory had produced a body of doctrine that addressed the extraction problem with considerably more clarity than the Army had started the war with. The Stabo harness was part of that doctrine. The specific procedures for combat extraction, the timing of smoke deployment, the sequence of attachment when a team member was wounded, the communication protocols between team and helicopter crew when rotor noise prevented radio communication. All of it had been developed by the men running the missions and passed from experienced teams to new ones, and it eventually made its way into formal training documents. The formal documents were, as is often the case, the last step in a process the field had already completed. The institutional pattern here is familiar enough that it deserves to be stated plainly, because it is not specific to Vietnam and it is not specific to the United States Army. The German medical service in World War II had sulfa drugs in its hospitals, while the American soldier carried sulfanilamide powder in his belt pouch. The German Army knew what the powder could do. The doctrinal decision to put it in every soldier's pocket was the thing they had not made. The Stabo harness in Vietnam had the same structure. The technology was available, the need was documented, the solution had been built by the men who needed it, and the institutional machinery processed the requirement at a pace that was out of phase with the operational cost of the delay. Men ran missions on McGuire rigs after the Stabo existed. Some of those men did not complete their extractions. The gap between the harness being built by Stevens, Knabb, and Clifford, and the harness being issued as standard equipment to all units conducting this type of operation, was a gap paid for in the category of men who reached the extraction point and did not make it onto the aircraft. This is not a comfortable thing to write, and it is made more uncomfortable by the fact that the men responsible for the supply gap were not, in most cases, men who were indifferent to what happened to teams in the field. The procurement system that moved slowly was moved slowly by factors that included real logistical constraints, real competing priorities, and the genuine difficulty of standardizing equipment that had originated as a field improvisation and existed in multiple non-identical versions. These were not trivial problems. They were also not sufficient justification for the outcome they produced. The men in the field who developed the Stabo had done the work that the system had not. They had looked at the McGuire rig's failure mode, which was by 1968 well documented and well understood, and they had built a solution to it. They had worn the solution on their bodies through operational missions to prove it functioned under the conditions it was designed for. They had briefed other units and shared fabrication information and demonstrated the attachment system. They had done everything except manufacture the device in the quantities that supply required. Gladion Barnes, in the story of the M26 Pershing and the 90mm gun, spent 2 years arguing for a weapon the engineers had already validated, while American tankers died in vehicles the arithmetic said were inadequate. The pattern is not identical, because it never is, but the structure is recognizable. The man closest to the problem sees it most clearly. The distance between seeing the problem and correcting the system is measured in time, and time in a combat environment has a different unit than it does in a conference room. Here is a thing about the Stabo harness that belongs in any honest account of what it meant to the men who wore it. The harness weighed approximately 2 pounds. In some configurations, slightly more. 2 pounds is not nothing when you are a LRRP team member. Managing a load that includes water for 5 days, rations, ammunition, radio equipment, medical kit, and the various items that experience had taught each individual team to carry. The weight problem on long-range operations was not theoretical. Teams were known to cut toothbrushes in half, to carry exactly the number of socks required for the mission duration and not one more, to weigh their rations against the caloric math of expected exertion over expected mission duration, and remove anything that did not clear the threshold. Ounces mattered because ounces accumulated into pounds, and pounds slowed movement, and slower movement increased noise, and increased noise increased the probability of detection. A team that added a 2-pound harness to every man's load was making a trade-off. 2 pounds per man was 12 pounds for a 6-man team. 12 pounds was real. It was felt at the end of day 4, when the canopy was still solid above, and the extraction point was still 300 meters of careful movement away. The teams accepted the trade-off. Every team that understood what the Stabo harness was for, that had been briefed on the McGuire Rig's failure mode, or had seen it fail personally, accepted 2 additional pounds per man, without significant resistance. The calculation was not complicated. 2 pounds of nylon webbing was the device that converted "might not make it off the rope if you're hit" into "will make it off the rope regardless." The cost was weight. The alternative was the loop. This acceptance is the clearest possible statement about the operational value of the harness. These were not men who carried weight indifferently. These were men who had stripped their personal gear to the minimum survivable load through experience, and who added 2 pounds of harness to that load deliberately, knowing what they were adding and knowing why. They had done the arithmetic that the supply system was still processing. The result was that the men closest to the problem, who understood it most directly and paid for it most personally, voted for the Stabo with the weight they agreed to carry. That vote is more informative than any requirements document. The Stabo harness and the body harness extraction principle it embodied survived Vietnam and shaped how American Special Operations Forces approached the same problem for decades afterward. The specific hardware changed as materials improved and manufacturing capabilities evolved. The principle did not. Modern military extraction harnesses used by Army Rangers and Special Forces trace a direct conceptual line through the Stabo to the McGuire Rig, to the question Charles McGuire was answering in 1965. How do you get a man out of terrain where a helicopter cannot land? The answer that Vietnam produced is now doctrine. The man carries the extraction capability on his body throughout the mission. The helicopter brings the connection point. The transfer takes seconds. The ability to extract an unconscious casualty is a requirement, not a secondary consideration. None of that was obvious in 1965. None of it was issued. It was worked out by men who needed it to work and built it from available materials until it did. The 75th Ranger Regiment, the institutional descendant of the Vietnam LRRP companies, maintains extraction training as a core competency. The specific exercises change as equipment and aircraft change. The principle is identical to the one Stevens and Knab and Clifford encoded into the original harness. The equipment holds the man, not the other way around. One more figure belongs in the accounting. The McGuire Rig, with all its limitations, was genuinely better than what had existed before it. Men are alive today, our grandfathers today, because of McGuire rigs that held, and helicopter crews that maintained the hover, and pilots who put the ropes through canopy gaps where ropes had no reasonable business fitting. The fact that the Stabo was better does not diminish what the McGuire Rig accomplished under the conditions it was operating under. It was an improvisation that worked until a better improvisation replaced it. Both were built by the same people, for the same reason, with the same institutional response from the supply system. The Stabo harnesses from Vietnam are in the world somewhere. In collections, in the boxes left behind by veterans' families, in estate sales where the item is listed as military web gear, condition fair, origin unknown. They are pieces of olive drab nylon webbing with adjustment buckles and D-rings that look, without context, like unremarkable surplus. With context, they are the physical record of an argument that was won in the field before it was processed by the system. The helicopter arrived. The ropes came through the canopy. What the 6 men had on their bodies when those ropes arrived was determined by when they had been issued, which units they had come from, which experienced teams had briefed them before their first mission, and whether the supply chain had reached them with anything better than what McGuire had built from climbing rope 3 years before. The historical record does not preserve the specific outcome of this specific hypothetical team on this specific night in late 1967. The A Shau Valley took many teams and gave some of them back, and some of it is in documents that are still restricted, and some of it is in the memories of men who are mostly gone now. And the rest is the silence that long-range reconnaissance operations were designed to leave behind. What is preserved is the larger pattern. Teams that had the right equipment came back at higher rates during the extraction phase. Teams that were on McGuire loops when a wounded man could not hold on did not come back complete. The math of those extractions accumulated over the years of the war into a difference that was real, even if it resists being reduced to a single clean statistic. The harness was the connection. 2 pounds of webbing and hardware, worn every day of every mission in every operational area where LRRP teams went, which covered most of the dangerous ground in South Vietnam, and a significant portion of the officially non-existent dangerous ground across the borders. It was on the body when the team inserted, and on the body when they called Prairie Fire, and on the body when the ropes came down. If this kind of forensic history, the kind where the equipment tells you something real about the men who used it, and the decisions that armed or failed to arm them, is something you want more of, subscribe. There is a long catalog of gear that reached the men who needed it later than it should have, and a longer catalog of the men who managed without it anyway. Their names deserve more documentation than they have received, and that documentation is work worth doing. The teams in the jungle came back when the equipment held. 2 pounds of nylon was the thing that made the difference between the harness holding and the loop requiring what the wounded man could no longer give. The men who wore it knew what it was worth. They carried it anyway, through all the days when they did not need it, so it would be there on the day they did. Most of the men who ran LRRP missions in Vietnam are old now, or are gone. The ones who are still here do not, as a rule, frame what they did in terms that match the way it tends to be written about. They talk about the men they went in with. They talk about the missions that came out right and the ones that did not. They do not talk about the gear as a separate category from the men who used it, because to them, it was never a separate category. The harness was the thing they wore. The men are the reason it mattered. Those two facts belong together and cannot be fully understood apart. If you've been watching this channel for a while and still haven't subscribed, now is the moment. Hit the button, turn on the notification bell, and join the community. We are here every day with the military history stories that deserve to be told straight, without softening what was hard, and without forgetting what was, in its own way, exactly right. Thank you for watching. Respect the fallen, honor the veterans, and never forget what they were fighting against. We will see you in the next video.